Here's one counterintuitive move that will transform your whole life is stand in I don't know. Stand in it, bask in it. See where it leads you. It'll lead you to places you could not have even anticipated. I promise you that much. But it's difficult to stand in I don't know because it's counterintuitive, because the ego wants to know. It takes a lot of humility, honesty, wisdom, and seriousness to admit I don't know. Not knowing is scary and threatening. And notice this, the more you know, the more you have to lose by admitting I don't know. So this is an especially big trap for religious people, but even more so perhaps for scientific people, for mathematicians, for logicians, for computer nerds. Because these types of people, public intellectuals, authors, academics, these type of people have built their whole lives and careers on priding themselves on knowing more than everybody else. I know because I've done that. I'm somewhat of a public intellectual. You know, I've been interested in philosophy my whole life. I've been very academic. I've prided myself a lot on knowing more than others. So I'm intimately familiar with the arrogance, the sort of intellectual arrogance and pride that comes with that. Maybe you're familiar with some of my own intellectual arrogance and pride that came from that. But I'm very well aware of that. You have to understand. A lot of intellectuals are not. And hey, I'm not saying I'm perfect. I also fall into those traps as an intellectual. So the trick here is you have to muster the courage to not know. And the way to muster that courage is to just recognize within your own self that it's like, it's better for me to admit that I've been wrong once than to forever spend the rest of my life pretending that I'm right and playing that game. You know, like for me personally, it's much easier just to admit that I was wrong because I only got to do that one time. It's just like a one day's worth of pain. But living, repressing and suppressing the truth that I was wrong for my whole life and acting as though my past beliefs and past worldview are right, even though I suspect that they're not, that's a recipe for pain for the rest of my life. So for me, it's pretty easy to admit being wrong when you kind of frame it that way. Because this really, the scales tip very much in favor of admitting you're wrong. But you have to kind of like think long term, right? Most people aren't thinking long term, so for them, they just want to kind of save themselves from the sort of short-term embarrassment of admitting they've been wrong. Like, here's an example. That was kind of abstract. Let me make it specific. Like, let's say you're a Mormon. It's a lot easier to just admit that Mormonism is basically a cult and that is deeply wrong. It's a lot easier to admit that, bite that bullet, suffer through a few months of withdrawal and whatever else, than it is to go on living your whole life within this Mormon cult. Doing years and decades of mental gymnastics, trying to, square in your own mind why Mormonism is right. Because, that's a full-time job. Because Mormonism is so wrong, you're going to spend the rest of your life justifying it to yourself just to maintain that belief system. And hey, I'm not picking just on Mormonism here. This will apply to Islam. This will apply to Christianity and many other things. But hey, a lot of people would rather just dig their head in the sand and just pretend as though their belief system, their worldview is right, and ignore all the counter evidence and not think very deeply about it. The nice thing about not knowing is that it sobers you out of fantasy. And that's what Mormonism is. It's a fantasy. That's what Christianity is. That's what Islam is. They're fantasies. Buddhism is a fantasy. Science, materialist science is a fantasy. Physics is a fantasy. These are fantasies. Not knowing is a powerful antidote to self-deception. Remember my series, 3-part series on self-deception? If you don't, go rewatch it. Very powerful series. And I give you a list of various self-deception mechanisms. I don't even remember. I haven't watched that in a few years. I don't remember. Did I give you antidotes in that series? How to deal with self-deception? Well, if I did not, then here's your antidote, not knowing. Very powerful. And that's not the only antidote to self-deception, but that's a very powerful one. Remember also I have an old episode called How Paradigms Work, where I talk about this concept called paradigm lock, where you get locked into a paradigm. Well, what's the antidote to paradigm lock? Guess what? Not knowing. That's one powerful antidote, not the only one. Not knowing breaks you out of closed-mindedness. Go check out my episode, How Open-Mindedness Works, and also another one called Radical Open-Mindedness. I stress open-mindedness a lot in my work. What do you do if you're closed-minded? Well, practice not knowing, and then your mind will open. But a closed-minded person precisely does not want to practice not knowing. So how do you get a closed-minded person to agree to practice not knowing? Well, you can't force them, only if they want to. And most of them won't. So I'd like you to start to become sensitive and brutally honest with yourself about when you really don't know a thing. This requires introspection. Go see my episode called Developing Introspection. You can develop an introspection with kind of a 2-minute, you kind of focus inwards, as I talked about in that episode, you focus inwards and you kind of feel around in there. When some topic comes up, like, let's say, how old is planet Earth? You could just immediately parrot out some number that you heard some scientist tell you in some textbook, like it's 4.3 billion years old. You could say that, or you could go, wait a minute. Do I really know how old the Earth is? You can introspect on that point. You can realize, okay, I got some ideas from some book that I read. That's one thing. But truly, I don't know. You can feel into the truth of I don't know is deeper than the truth of what you read in some book that you instinctively want to parrot out as the good little scientist that you fancy yourself to be. So that's a practice. You practice that for the rest of your life. That's what I'm suggesting with this episode. If you're wondering, like, Leo, this is so abstract, what do I do with this? You practice that. You actually do that. You introspect, you stop yourself from just parroting stuff you've heard from other apes, and you actually go into the I don't know. Now, with I don't know, it's very tricky because not knowing, you can hold it as a theory, or you can actually be in a state of not knowing. These are two different things. What you've gotten so far from me in this episode is just theory. It's the theory of not knowing. And you can sit there and you say, like, I don't know this, I don't know that. Yeah, Leo, I can kind of accept the idea that maybe I don't know as much as I thought I knew, or that maybe some of the things I know are kind of wrong or self-biased or whatever. Yeah, I can agree with that, Leo, okay. What do I do with that? That's theory. That's the theory of not knowing. That theory is not the same thing as actually being in a state of not knowing.